Hi, I'm Claire, and yes, as I've been introduced, I'm an atmospheric chemist. And that means that my research is all about understanding the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And the reason that we're interested in this is because of issues like ozone depletion, greenhouse gases, and air quality. And today I'm going to share some stories from working in the field, starting with talking about traveling to the Arctic to look at the chemistry involved in ozone depletion, and then I'm going to talk about measuring emissions from bushfires, and finally talk about measuring greenhouse gases on the Murray River in the depths of the Barmah forest. Before I start, I need to explain there are two basic ways that you can measure the chemical composition of the air. One is just to suck it into the instrument like you were breathing it into your lungs, and to measure it within the instrument. The other is to measure the gases remotely using light. Gases absorb parts of light and leave a kind of fingerprint so that you can look at the spectrum of light and work out what gases are there and in what quantity. So this image shows a solar tracker on the top of the chemistry building here at the University of Wollongong. The tracker takes light into the instrument in the building below and into the spectrometer, where it can separate it into the different frequencies so we can see the light that's being absorbed by the gases and work out what's there. There's a whole network of these instruments around the globe, and in order to do good science, we need to ensure that all these instruments agree with one another. So one way to do that is to have a traveling standard instrument, and I had the luck in the 1990s to be one of the people involved in taking this instrument and running it alongside other instruments in the globe, and particularly in the high Arctic, in order to make sure that the instruments all agreed with one another. So I went to these three different sites, first to Spitsbergen. I think you can probably see that image. You can see England down sort of to the right in the middle. I was living in London at the time, so we went up to Spitsbergen, which is about the same amount north of Iceland as Iceland is from north of Britain. Also to Kiruna, I won't talk about that much today. And finally to Eureka in the high north of the Canadian Arctic. So my first experience in the Arctic was in Spitsbergen. This was a pretty intense experience for me. It took 4 separate flights to get there from London in an increasingly smaller aircraft. And I think there were 2 flights past when I last saw something growing beyond ankle height. And when we arrived there, it was quite a strange atmosphere. Everyone was very jumpy. We arrived in May, and in February, a 19-year-old student had been eaten by a polar bear. That meant that we were largely confined to the base, and even when we wanted to go up to the airstrip, we were required to carry a very large rifle, which I had no idea what to do with. We were fed very strangely. There was a large communal kitchen, and it served things like pickled fish and smoked reindeer, but there was nowhere you could make yourself a cup of coffee. But the strangest thing of all was 24-hour daylight. So no day and no night, just one long continuous day. This should have been great for us because we have the solar tracker, we want to make those measurements in the sunlight, but it was the cloudiest time of my life. So we had to take it in turns to check out and wake up in the sort of night when we were trying to sleep to check whether we had good weather. So you wake up at midnight, I'll wake up at 2, you wake up at 4, I'll wake up at 6, etc. So 3 long weeks went by. My colleagues left. My boss said I could stay there till the end of the year if I need to. Finally, when I'd given up hope of going home, the clouds cleared and we got good measurements, and we ascertained that yes, indeed, the instruments agreed with the expected range, and I could go home. So very excitedly, I went to the airstrip, but when I arrived there, the pilot said, "Oh, is there a person there as well? We've already packed all the boxes." I'm so desperate to get out, I had to climb and squeeze myself between the boxes and the top of the aircraft and wriggle along the length of it to the one spare seat behind the pilot. And when I returned to London, I really felt like I was returning from Moon Base 4. I think the most alien thing was the 24-hour daylight. We take for granted that day follows night and night follows day, and the absence of that made the Arctic feel very otherworldly to me. So the last of the trips that I made to the Arctic was to Eureka in the north of Canada. And this was even more remote. It took 6 flights to get there, from London to Toronto to Ottawa, from Ottawa to Iqaluit, from Iqaluit to Resolute, and finally to Eureka. It really felt like another world. Sometimes we got whiteouts where you couldn't see where the sky ended and the sea began, or where the land ended and the sea began because of the snow and the ice. It was extremely cold, like typical temperatures of about minus 35 degrees centigrade, so you really couldn't spend very long outside. We were thousands and thousands of miles from the nearest doctor, which was a slight concern to me because at the time I was pregnant with my first child. And I remember sipping fruit juice throughout the day to stave off the morning sickness because I hadn't yet admitted to my colleagues of my current condition. But the wonderful thing was there was sunshine. And even better, the solar tracker of the instrument there couldn't rotate the full 360 degrees. And so we had an enforced time of 9 hours when we couldn't work and we could go back and use the blackout blinds to sleep. One of the things you can see in the lower left-hand corner, the photograph there, that's me and my colleague. We'd walked out to visit the iceberg across the frozen sea. We had to wear these neoprene masks because if you were unlucky, like a previous Japanese colleague, he hadn't factored in the wind chill, and when he returned from the iceberg, he got frostbite on his face. So this was my last Arctic trip, and 3 years later, I emigrated to Australia. So since moving to the University of Wollongong, the type of field work I've done has changed somewhat, and I've become really interested in bushfires, and particularly their effect on air quality. So in this image, you can see a spectrometer at the front. There's a telescope attached, and I hope you can see through the burning bushes that there's some mirrors there. So in a very similar way to the solar remote sensing, what we're doing here is we're looking at the spectral pattern that the gases being emitted by the fire makes in our path. And this information can then feed into air quality models that look at the impact downwind of the fires on our air quality. Obviously, the challenges in the field are very different from being in the Arctic. It's heat that's a problem, not cold. You have to watch for falling branches. We had to have some basic bushfire training. You have to be aware of the occasional incendiary device thrown by somebody in a helicopter above. But another thing that makes this really different is that often you can be home for a late tea and kiss your child goodbye at night. So obviously this is a more suitable type of field work for me when I had a family. In the last couple of years, I've also had the opportunity to go to Malaysia and study the emissions from peat fires. These peat fires cause absolutely terrible air quality episodes that cover the whole of Southeast Asia and are locally known as the haze. And while we were there, we discovered that freshly ignited fires were far more polluting than more developed and older fires. We also, obviously, the problem is mainly the heat. The temperature, rather than being minus 35 degrees like in the Arctic, is more like plus 35 degrees, and it's extremely humid. What we found is some of the instruments wouldn't work well in the heat, but as you can see, my student became a dab hand at building shelters out of palm fronds to shelter the instruments and himself to a temperature that he was able to work. So finally, I'm going to talk about another type of field work that I did looking at greenhouse gas exchange on the Murray River. It was a very nice and tranquil visit down the river, but we were in a camp boat, and the idea was that you would camp out and there were sort of sleeping places along the side, but we needed a lot of room for the instruments we were running, and by the time we put all the equipment into the boat, there was barely anywhere for us to stand, let alone sleep. So we needed to find somewhere that we could moor up each night and camp on the side of the river. We found that we had some really bad flooding here in the Barmah forest, so that we had some challenges some night. I remember mooring up in almost complete darkness, trying to find somewhere that wasn't ankle deep in wet. And the other problem was that the Barmah forest has the Barmah forest virus, which is something very similar to the Ross River virus, and it's spread by mosquito bites. And I swear to you, I've never seen a higher concentration of insects than I experienced in the Barmah forest. So finally, I'd just like to say, when I look back on my 25 years as an atmospheric chemist, almost all of the highlights are from working in the field. And I feel that it impacts on other parts of life. Field campaigns set markers in the passing of the time in the same way as large events in life do, like weddings and births. And sharing these intense experiences builds real friendship in the fields. So if you meet up with people that you worked with in a campaign, many years later at a conference, it really feels like you're meeting an old friend. And I think that field work has had a major influence on the person that I am today. I consider myself extremely lucky to have had the opportunities that fieldwork provides, and I would recommend a career that includes fieldwork to anyone who will take the time to listen to me. And thank you.